Hello, History Detectives audience. I am Jen Morrison, and I'm excited to have the opportunity to share with you about my book, Open Mausoleum Door, which I published just this past summer. I'm grateful to the History Detectives organizers who worked so hard all year to bring us this great program to our community. It's always such a good lineup of presentations and speakers and cool old photos, and sometimes the topic is something you've always been curious about, and sometimes it's something you never thought about or ever dreamed would be so interesting. But either way, it's a good program, and one of the really cool things about History Detectives is its popularity. So it's been able to connect such a good broad audience with the topic of local history. I think local history is fascinating and important and relevant. I've dedicated my career to it, so I'm currently the Associate Archivist for the Dominican Sisters of Grand Rapids. Such a great job. Talk about fascinating history that's also important and relevant. Before that, I was the Aquinas College Archivist, and before that, I worked for 15 years in the local history department of the public library with its extremely valuable collection of materials, and became so familiar with all those things and also learned so much about our city. So that was also a really great job to have. Local history is what I've dedicated my career to. It's also often one of my favorite hobbies, and it is what I call a local history obsession that I pursued and wrote about in my book. So it all started for me on a day over 15 years ago when I was wandering Oak Hill Cemetery with my niece, who was 12 years old at the time. The Christmas before, she had given me a gift certificate to spend the day with her. I was thrilled. I wanted to do something memorable. I had recently discovered Oak Hill Cemetery working on another project related to Emily Clark and kind of fell in love with the cemetery. I really enjoyed wandering the lanes and seeing familiar names and learning new things about these folks from their monuments, seeing a different side of them. I loved the art and the architecture, which is sometimes actually thrilling. Giant pyramids and intricately carved monoliths and stone angels and stained glass and Celtic crosses. It's just amazing to just walk around Oak Hill Cemetery. And then I can say that I always feel a presence in the cemetery. Now that's common. I think unfortunately a lot of times our culture wants to encourage the interpretation of that as being something kind of spooky. And actually, I think if you're paying attention, what's happening there is just an awareness or a connection with this broader realm that exists somehow with this population of people who have gone to the next place. And I wondered if my niece, who was 12, would be able to cue into any of that in any way, any of that kind of excitement and interest in the cemetery and in history that I was. She had no special interest in history, so this was very much an experiment. But I wanted to try it, and I did. I talk more about that in the book, about how that day went, how she responded. I talk more about Oak Hill and some of the cool features there and cemeteries in general. But for now, I will say that I kept this kind of a secret. I drove her to the cemetery that day, encouraged her to get out of the car and to explore. And I asked her to lead and suggested that she tell me what was of interest, and that I promised her that if she saw something that she wanted to learn more about, that we would next go to the local history center at the Grand Rapids Public Library where I had been working, and we'd see what we could learn about this monument. So I had to stop myself from sort of encouraging her to connect with some of these monuments that I knew would have a lot of documentation. I mostly was able to do that, and she did choose a mausoleum, a pretty red sandstone mausoleum, Egyptian revival, with an intriguing figure over the doorway that became kind of a mystery for her and for me. And the name Rush, R-U-S-H. And these were folks, this was a name that I was not familiar with. So we did go to the library next, and we went to the local history department, and we started with a guess. We simply took an old volume off the shelf from the mid-1890s. I figured these folks in this mausoleum were probably prominent. Their name might stick out somehow. The occupation might stick out, and it was probably in the mid-1890s. And by the time we finished with our visit, we learned that in this mausoleum were father and son architects, Amos, William, and Edwin Arthur Rush. Amos the father, Edwin the son. Edwin died without descendants. We not only looked at city directories, but we found census information online. We scrolled through newspapers on microfilm and found the obituaries for these men. Primarily, the information was brief, and I, of course, was hoping to hit the jackpot and find this nice substantive cache of documentation. I was looking for one of those juicy county history entries where the writer has actually interviewed the subject, and certainly would have loved to have found a photo for her. I wanted to kind of bring these people to life for her, to make them human, relatable. So I was a little disappointed. She, however, seemed to have a good time. She said at one point, I like history when it's like this, when you're trying to find somebody or find something. So take note, educators, was the discovery that was kind of exciting for her. Of course, I couldn't let it go. So after that day, I thought to myself, I wonder if I can just think of a couple other resources that I could check. And that is the point at which this became more my adventure than hers, because I then spent a decade checking just a few more resources. Initially, when I began to research on my own, I was finding almost exclusively information about the buildings that these men designed. And originally, I was actually not very interested in that. It seemed tangential. Again, I wanted a human story. I didn't want to know about the career of the men necessarily. But I did not dismiss the buildings entirely. One of the buildings, for example, was a home on Cherry Street, and it was built for Thomas Bryant, who gained his wealth during the lumber industry in kind of a little different way than the mill owners did, and there's more about that in the book. His home was beautiful, elaborate. It was described as one of the showpieces of the city, and it was in the Hill District, which was one of the neighborhoods with the highest property values in the 1890s. And then, of course, over time, that neighborhood changed. One of the changes was just urban sprawl. So originally the Hill District was kind of on the edges of town, and ultimately the commercial district encroached. But there were other changes, weren't there? And I must admit, especially 10 years ago, that I was very naive about those changes. But I was becoming really curious. Why do neighborhoods and cities change? Why do they deteriorate? Why do they segregate? What's that all about? And I began researching and couldn't stop. And I learned a story about race riots. I learned a story about a major important historic preservation initiative. I learned a story about city government. And I was going to show you a picture from my book. There's lots of good pictures in my book from the Grand Rapids Public Library of this home, but I'm going to be a little mysterious about that. You guys are history detectives, and I have a feeling you know this home, and I have a feeling you know who moved into this home in 1969 and who was determined to live in the inner city and to make it a safe place and to restore these beautiful old buildings. And all on its own, that building was beginning to tell me a story of my own city. Another of the Rush buildings was the Jefferson Avenue School. And the Jefferson Avenue School, again, a beautiful big building. At the time it was built, it had state-of-the-art heating and ventilation systems. It was built in a what was described as the middle to upper class Dutch neighborhood. Again, I was learning about the changes that happen over time in these neighborhoods, about the story of schools and the role that they played in our population. And unfortunately, in the 1970s, the building was demolished. There's a newspaper article about it. I'm lucky there was, because there didn't seem to be a lot of community interest or outcry about the destruction of this old building. The newspaper article shows men taking a sledgehammer to these beautiful old wood floors. There was a beautiful stone arch with intricate stone carvings on it. But again, the neighborhood had changed, and the reporter for this story then described the neighborhood at the time the building was demolished as being a poor Black neighborhood that potentially couldn't support another elementary school. What was that about? I became so interested. I came from a smaller town and I didn't understand a lot of these things, and was naive in a way that unfortunately too many of us are. A third building was built as a hotel directly across the street from Union Station. It would have been an upscale hotel. Again, beautiful features and stone carving, and it would have been directly across the street from Union Station, where people getting off the train would have find it and have a place to stay or to eat. As early as the 1926, this building was purchased by a couple from Chicago, and they were Black. And so for many decades, the 40s, the 50s for sure, and a little before that and a little after that, it became a segregated entertainment venue. People who are interested in jazz history know this building and know the proprietor for many years was named Stanley Barnett. So this building survives today. It's another one that I think you know, and you may well have even been inside of it. It's a public place today, and whether or not you have been, you may or may not have noticed that there is a small plaque on the front of the building indicating that the building was designed by Amos and Edwin Rush. And then finally, a fourth building that I really focused on was a building at Coit and Michigan Street that was demolished for the interstate for I-96 the week I was born, and was originally not just designed by the Rush men, but it was designed for them. It was their own home. And I could have written an entire book just on this home because it taught me so much. And it was so intriguing. It played a trick on me. It seemed, for all the world, for a period of time, to exist at two separate addresses at the same time. And figuring that out really took me on an adventure. I learned, again, about interstates, about the incredible difference that they made on our landscape in the 1960s at mid-century. And I also, ironically, learned a human story, a family story from this building. So I got what I had longed for from the beginning, finally in this building, in the details of this building. So buildings can tell stories, and they can tell secrets. They can share information that has been lost in time and hidden over the decades. And they told me a story about a personal family tragedy that befell this family. It then brought clarity to everything else that we knew about the Rush family at that point. And I wanted to tell that story. That story had drama, it had irony, it was poignant. I also wanted to tell this story about the city that I was learning. We live in this city. We travel and work in this city and eat and drink in this city, and we negotiate the spaces and the neighborhoods and the landscape. And we, or I particularly, was not even aware of all the forces that have created this landscape and this environment. And that I found fascinating, to learn the history of the buildings that I walk past every day. Between those two stories, I was developing a lot of broader ideas about the very concept of community. What is community? Who is community? What are the implications of community and the way that it changes, and the way that it affects individuals and groups? And I've often said that we are all connected across town and across time. And I wanted to describe that. And that is what I hope I did in my book. I hope also that it's as interesting to read and as fun to read as it was for me to research and to write. And I hope you'll come to History Detectives and pick up a copy. I will be there and I can sign the book. And not only will you see a really wonderful program, but you can get this great book that I've written and that I will sign for you. The first 10 people I have an extra little fun present for as a thank you. If you can't go to History Detectives for some reason, you can get the book at Schuler's, at Schuler Books on 28th Street. You can pick it up off the shelf or you can order it online. But I hope you'll come to History Detectives because it's going to be so fun. And I would love to see you there. Thank you.